Our guest, please.
Okay. All right, thank you. Well, thank you, Doug. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Welcome to another in a series of monthly program meetings sponsored by the Woods and Wetlands Group of the Illinois Sierra Club. My name is Rosemary Heileman, and I will be your host this evening. Our monthly program meetings feature speakers on topics related to our environment, steward, wildlife and nature, public policy, and anything about outdoor activities like hiking and canoeing, bird watching, etc. Tonight is the final program for 2022. In a minute, we will hear from our featured speaker for November, Grant Spickelmier, Executive Director, International Wolf Center based in Ely, Minnesota. The International Wolf Center advances the survival of wolf populations, teaching about wolves, their relationship to wildlands, and the human role in their future. But first, we have a couple of brief announcements. As Doug said, we are recording this so that you can watch it in the future. Turn off your camera if you don't wish to appear on the video. We will send out the YouTube address for the program later this week so you can watch it again. Before we begin, please make sure you are muted, especially if you have a barking dog, a television, or other commotion in the background. Please feel free to ask any questions of our speaker this evening by using the chat room at the bottom of your screen. We will select questions afterward, and they will be directed to the speaker. Now let's move on to our November featured speaker. Grant Spickelmier joined the International Wolf Center as Executive Director in January of 2020. Grant is a lifelong environmental educator and advocate for wildlife conservation with nearly 30 years of experience, most recently as the curator of the conservation learning at Oregon Zoo in Portland, Oregon. Before that, he worked as an educator and manager at the Minnesota Zoo, where his interest in wolves was first kindled. Grant holds BA degrees in both biology and education and an MS in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota. Welcome, Grant. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thanks so much, Rosemary. I'm glad to be here and glad to join your webinar series. I started talking with Linda Tilton about this talk about a month and a half ago, and I was feeling out what type of information she was most interested in, and she kept listing more and more things about wolves, and I said, well, you know, you've covered pretty much the gamut of all of our presentations, so what I've put together for you tonight is I've called it Wolf 101, but it's really going to cover a lot of different topics. Everything from just basic wolf natural history and behavior to kind of the current status of wolves here in the United States, and a little bit about the recovery story that's going on with wolves both here and around the globe. We are the International Wolf Center, and while we talk a lot about wolves here in the Midwest and in the United States, we also try to keep people up to speed on what's going on in places like Scandinavia and India and all over the world. So I'm going to share my screen here so you can start presentation. All right. Great. So like I said, and Rosemary did a great job introducing our mission. This is our mission statement. The International Wolf Center, we seek to advance the survival of wolf populations by teaching about wolves, their relationship to wildlands, and the human role in their future. We were founded in 1985 by Dr. Dave Meach, who is one of the founding fathers of wolf biology. He started researching wolves. He started the Wolf Research Project on Isle Royale as a undergrad student, actually, and then a grad student in 1958, working with Durwood Allen from, I believe, Michigan Tech. And so he started that project, and then he moved over to Minnesota and was researching wolves in northern Minnesota in the 60s and 70s, back at the time when they'd been pretty much extirpated or wiped out of the rest of the United States, the lower 48. And his research was really the impetus, one of the main factors in wolves being put on the endangered species list and on the earlier legislation or before the endangered species list that protected them. After doing his research for many, many decades, he also had a strong interest in educating people about what real wolves were like. And so he founded a center in Ely, Minnesota, which is way up in northern Minnesota, right in his study area, and had a traveling exhibit called Wolves and Humans that actually was traveling around different science museums at the time. That was kind of the exhibit that encompassed a lot of his research. And they worked together to establish a building where that exhibit could live permanently in 1993. So we're actually about ready to celebrate our 30th anniversary next year for the visitor center up in Ely. And then 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, in 2019, we developed a new exhibit called Discover Wolves that's now in that visitor center. So that's just a little bit about the center. The other kind of interesting thing about our organization is we are an education organization first and foremost. Dave really believed in the power of good information and getting good information out about wolves and talking about what science has taught us about wolves and wolf behavior. But we are not a political organization. We're not a strong political advocacy organization. We don't push for legislation. We don't get involved in lawsuits. We really are just out there trying to teach people about wolves and have good conversations about wolves. And I have to tell you, in the last few years, that's gotten to be a tricky business because wolves are very much a political topic and the center of a lot of controversies and raise a lot of emotion on people on both sides of the debate. So for us to kind of try to stay the course and stay as a convener and an educator in the midst of that dialogue is challenging. Let's see. So let me tell you a little bit about who lives at our visitor center. We do have an exhibit pack of wolves. We have 5 wolves currently. This is Axel and Grayson. There are 2 Arctic wolves. Their pup picture is behind me on the wall here, if you want to see what they looked like. This is what they look like now, all grown up. They're about 6.5 years old. And they are, like I said, the Arctic subspecies. Rika is a 1.5-year-old female. She represents the northwestern subspecies, which is the subspecies of gray wolf that lives in Western Canada and down into Montana and Wyoming and Yellowstone National Park, that area. So you can tell she's got a little gray or brown fur. And then these are our 2 new additions this year, Kaz and Blackstone. They also are northwestern subspecies, although they've got this really interesting coloration, almost a reddish coloration that has stuck with them as they've gotten older. They were born in April of this year. So they're, I guess, just getting to be about 6 months old right now. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we do at the center at the end of the presentation. But for now, I'm going to shift us over into talking about wolves in general. So where can we find wolves? Well, the answer is lots of places. Wolves are primarily a northern hemisphere animal. They do dip down a little bit into the Arabian Peninsula and into India, but the majority of the wolves in the world are in the northern hemisphere. You can see where they currently live in green and where they've been extirpated or lost their home ranges in red. So they used to be very, very widespread, and they are recovering in a lot of places. But you can see that they have been pushed out of several places as well. We'll talk more about why later. But one of the most interesting things I find about gray wolves, and one of the things I just love about them, is they are so versatile. They can live in so many different landscapes, from the tundra of the far north to the Great Plains, there are Mexican wolf subspecies that lives in the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico. And then, of course, the forests here in the Midwest are very good habitat for gray wolves. how they manage to do that is by adapting to their environment. And there are many different subspecies of gray wolf and several different species of wolf that have adapted to different environments, everything from the Arctic subspecies here to the Indian wolf, which is actually a separate species of wolf. But you can just get a sense of how they may adapt to those different climes by their, the thickness of their fur, their body type, whether how lean they are, how big they are, even how their face is configured. So the wolf is a very adaptable animal, and just adapted for the Arctic wolf on the left, for instance, has fur between his toes to keep his toes from freezing in ice, while the Indian gray wolf has those big long ears to help him radiate heat and get rid of heat. So just really amazing evolutionary adaptations to their environment, but still wolves. A wolf is a wolf is a wolf, and is one of the quotes from Dr. Meach, our founder. But that's just one of the most amazing things about them. Very adaptable. There are actually two wolf species that live here in North America, a gray wolf and a red wolf. We're not going to talk much about the red wolf, because they are in a very, very small part of North Carolina as the only place they live currently. They are endangered species, highly endangered, much more so than the gray wolf. And there's currently only about 9 left in the wild. There's about 250 to 300 in captivity as part of a red wolf endangered species breeding program that many, many zoos and sanctuaries are participating in. But there really is the two subspecies or two species of wolf, and then many different subspecies of gray wolf. So you'll hear those terms kind of getting bandied about, and there's actually a lot of debate still in the scientific community about different subspecies and whether they can qualify as a separate species. Right now, there's an argument about the eastern wolf that lives in eastern Canada and dips down occasionally into New York and the Northeast United States, as maybe that is a separate species, or maybe it's a crossbred breed between coyotes and gray wolves, or red wolves and gray wolves. So there's a lot of debate about the species and subspecies of wolves, but as far as right now, there are only 2 official species of gray wolf in North America, the gray wolf and the red wolf. And we're going to focus mostly on the gray wolf, like I said. So here's where you can find gray wolves currently in the United States. And when I'm talking about present, I'm not talking about occasionally being seen. I'm talking about established populations. For instance, Northern Illinois, I did a little research. It looks like you've had about 12 or so sightings of gray wolves in your state in the last 15 to 20 years. They do come down into Illinois, but they are not established in Illinois. They don't breed and raise their families in Illinois. So these are the states where they have established populations. And of course, this is a big turnaround in the last 20, 30 years. As recently as the 1980s, you really would have just seen Minnesota, Alaska, and maybe a little bit of northern Wisconsin and northern Michigan would have had wolf populations. So all the rest of the blue that's on this map has happened really in the last 30 years. And a lot of it occurred after 1995 when wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone and into Idaho. A lot of the growth in especially the American West has since then. Here's the Midwest numbers right now. We've got our most recent census in Minnesota had about 2,700 wolves. The Wisconsin numbers just came out last year, about 800 wolves. That's down a bit from their, if you remember seeing the newspaper articles about the wolf hunt that happened there in the brief period where wolves were off the endangered species list. Their current estimate is they're at about 812. Before the hunt, they were at probably about 900 to 950, somewhere in there. So they did lose a substantial chunk of the population, although wolves are resilient, and one thing we know about wolves is they do bounce back pretty quickly. And then about 660 wolves in northern Michigan. And like I said, you don't see wolves in Illinois or Iowa, but I can tell you wolves do go down there. This is why. This is an example of a wolf that was tracked from Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota, and he traveled over a period of about it was just like from May to January, so it was less, maybe 7-8 months. He traveled 1,388 miles. And this is a pretty typical behavior for young wolves. Both young males and young females will leave their pack and go and find a mate. And sometimes these wolves, especially the males, for some reason, it always seems to be the males that get the wander bug the most. And they will just go and go and go for hundreds and hundreds of miles. They'll cross freeways, they'll cross traffic, and they'll skirt around cities, and they'll end up in the craziest places like the cornfields of Iowa or Nebraska. And they will occasionally get down in Illinois. The hard thing with those wolves, of course, is if they travel that distance into a place that has no other wolves, they aren't going to be successful. Plus which there isn't much habitat for them. They're most likely going to end up getting hit by a car or being shot by somebody. So it's not a very successful strategy for them, depending on which direction they head. So talking about being shot, there are places in the United States where it is legal to hunt wolves. This is often confusing to people because they hear that wolves are on the endangered species list, and they are, but they are officially delisted in 4 states, Alaska, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Now, they have always been delisted in Alaska. They've never been considered endangered or threatened up in Alaska. There's a population of probably 10 to 15,000 wolves up there. And they have been considered a very healthy population. And so they've always had wolf hunts up in Alaska. Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, they were endangered for a long period in the 90s and early 2000s when they were being established. But in the kind of late 2000s, they did pass legislation that made the states, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, responsible for their own management policies. And so they did establish hunting seasons, especially outside of Yellowstone National Park and some of the protected federal lands in those states. And they do have hunting rights and hunting seasons. But currently they are not allowed to be hunted anywhere else they are established. You did see that brief period last year where they were taken off the endangered species list, and Wisconsin had an automatic trigger law that required them to hold a wolf hunt the minute they were off the endangered species list. And then, so that is why they had a hunt. Minnesota and Michigan both made the decision instead to start working on their state management plans and wait to decide on whether to do a hunt until their state management plans were completed. In that time period, while Minnesota was getting ready to release its state management plan, wolves were put back on the endangered species list, and to some extent it kind of took the pressure off in terms of making that decision. But I know both Minnesota and Wisconsin have now released, well, Minnesota I don't think is officially released its new state management plan yet. It's in the works. I've seen a rough draft of it where they will talk about, if they get taken off the endangered species list again, how they will make the decision on whether or not to allow a hunt to take place. And so, this is something each state agency, I think, is working on and trying to consider. Other places have passed their own state legislation protecting the species. So for instance, California has its own endangered species list, and wolves are on the endangered species list there. So even if they get delisted federally, they would stay on the California endangered species list. So it's a complicated soup, and I don't actually pretend to know all about it. Anytime I need to know the legal things, I call up one of my board members who's a lawyer and involved in environmental law and have him track down what's going on in each state. But there's a lot of movement right now. All right, I said I would get to some basic wolf stuff and show some fun pictures. So I'm going to start at the very beginning and just walk you through a year in the life of a wolf pack. Because, I think people think they know a lot about wolves, but I think we make a lot of assumptions, and we definitely have heard a lot of stories over the years. And some of those are based in the truth and in what we know about wolves factually, but some of them are just kind of imaginations that we come up with. So for instance, one of the things is when we talk about a pack, I think a lot of people envision a pack as this group of adult wolves that comes together and fights for who's going to be the dominant wolf, the alpha wolf, and then they have the beta wolves, and they kind of establish that hierarchy. Well, our founder, Dave Meach, is actually the person who really coined the phrase alpha wolf back in the 80s. And he doesn't use that term anymore because the more research he did, the more he realized a pack is just a family. Most packs are made up of a breeding male, breeding female, and their offspring. Maybe it's the offspring of a couple of years, so you have some older, yearlings and 2-year-olds and some youngers. But most of the time, a pack is just a family. Now, in Yellowstone, things have gotten a little more interesting. They have had packs where they've had multiple breeders. They've had packs where adults have been adopted by a pack into the pack, and some different things have happened there. But still, even in Yellowstone, the majority of packs are going to be wolves that are related to each other by blood, and that just, it kind of changes the way you think about them a little bit. I think, like I said, that term alpha wolf often made people think that wolves were constantly challenging each other for dominance in the pack, and that really doesn't happen that often. There's a dominance and submission battle, but it's often very established because, hey, you're my dad, I'm not going to oust you, and I understand that my role is to be submissive to you. Wolf pups are typically born in April and May. The breeding season is usually in February, right around Valentine's Day appropriately. And we notice this every year, actually about this time of year, the hormones start to kick in when the weather gets cold and our males start getting a little more aggressive with each other. And then breeding would happen in February, and then the pups would be born after about 60 days in a den in April or May. That den can be, this kind of stereotypical rock site. It can be under the roots of a tree, depending on the terrain in the area. And they'll stay in that den for just a few weeks. They can be like 4 to 6 wolves in a litter. This is a very dangerous time for a wolf in the wolf's life. It's a risky time for them. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the den. They're very young, they're very vulnerable. They can get flooded out if there's heavy snowmelt or rain. They can get diseases that can come through and wipe out a litter. And of course, they can be preyed upon by other animals like black bears. So it's a very dangerous time. Most wolves have about a 50% chance of making it through their first year of life. So it's wild wolves. It's a rough first year. For wild wolves. If they make it past that first year, they can usually make it to 5 or 6, but it's a hard go in that first year. Now, we've all heard about territories. Wolves do establish territories. This is one map showing how different wolves in Algonquin Park established their territories for their families, and you can see right away, they're all kind of about the same size, and they all are pretty good at not overlapping much. Wolves, again, contrary to kind of our imagination of wolves constantly fighting each other for dominance, wolves actually try to avoid fighting as much as they can. It's not really a good survival strategy if you're constantly having to battle other wolves. So, they'll do this type of fighting instead, smell fighting. Marking territory, leaving scent on trees so that they understand, okay, this is somebody else's territory. This is an active way that wolves defend their territory by marking it. They also howl to mark their territory. That's one of the main uses of their howls, is to establish, hey, there are wolves in this area, and you know, it kind of gives you a sense of how many wolves there might be in an area. If you hear multiple wolves and you're a smaller pack, you're going to be like, okay, you know, we're going to stay away from them. They sound like they got a big group. So, you know, wolves do a lot of behaviors to help them avoid getting into conflict with other wolves. Now, if wolves do walk into each other's territory, they will be very aggressive in defending them. And especially in Yellowstone, if you watch any of the Yellowstone videos and reports, you know that wolves are regularly killing other wolves in that park. And that does happen quite often. But they are trying through all these other techniques to avoid that if they can. Another thing that establishes territory is the amount of prey in an area. If there's high prey density, they can have a smaller territory. If there's fewer prey in an area, they have to have a larger territory. And this can lead to very, widely varying sizes in home ranges for wolf packs. So for instance, up in the Arctic tundra, there's not a lot of vegetation. Therefore, there's not a lot of prey species like moose in one particular area. They're very spread out across a very large landscape. So that means wolves there can have territories as large as 1,000 square miles. One wolf pack will range through 1,000 square miles for food and guard it from other wolves. Here in northern Minnesota, we have a lot of deer and a lot of animals for wolves to eat. So our packs are usually in territories of size about 40 to 60 square miles. And they're very tightly packed together, and they're pretty saturated. In fact, that number I showed you of about 2,700 wolves in northern Minnesota, the northern third of our state, that hasn't moved much in the last 10 years. And that's because most of our scientists think that wolves have pretty much established territories everywhere that's suitable for wolves to live. All right, what do wolves eat? Well, we kind of gave you some idea on that already. It's primarily ungulates or hooved animals. Depending on where they live, that could be moose, deer, bison, caribou, elk, lots of muskox up in the Arctic tundra. Pretty amazing when you think of wolves taking down, these 2,000-pound animals like bison and moose, or the really fast, white-tailed deer. They're, again, very adaptable and one of the few predators that can take on these large hooved animals. Here in Minnesota, just to give you a breakdown, the primary diet of wolves in Minnesota is going to be white-tailed deer, and then moose makes up the next chunk, and beaver, which is a really interesting one. I think we knew that wolves occasionally would eat a beaver, but some of the latest work being done by the researchers with the Voyageurs Wolf Project and Voyageurs National Park have now established that it's a much bigger part of their diet than we thought, especially in the summer months when white-tailed deer become a lot harder to catch for wolves. So they ambush beavers coming out to gnaw on tree trunks, and they eat quite a few beaver in the summer months. But one of the other things that's really interesting about wolves is they will eat a lot of things when they're hungry. And so, for instance, they have been videoed grazing on blueberries in the northern part of Minnesota. They've been seen fishing. There are definitely places in the world where they've been seen going into garbage dumps. We were just had a symposium here in the Twin Cities where we had one of the leading Italian wolf researchers, and he was asked, what do wolves eat in Italy? And he said, spaghetti. And we all kind of laughed, and he said, no, I'm not kidding. He says, there are a wolf pack that's right near the towns, and they come in and eat the garbage, and they eat spaghetti because there's just not enough prey species in that particular part of Italy. Now, I will say, when you see wolves eating blueberries like this, they do not think this is helping them thrive. This is what you would call a starvation food. I don't know how many of you remember the book or the movie Never Cry Wolf, where the Farley Moat discovered that wolves survive on mice. Well, that is not completely true. They will eat mice, they will catch mice and eat mice, but they cannot survive on mice. And they cannot survive on blueberries. So when you see them eating blueberries like this, that's really just an indication that they haven't gotten a deer in a while, and they're very hungry, and they're filling their gut with whatever they can find. Well, let's talk about one of the things that I think is most fascinating about wolves is how does an animal that weighs about 60 to 100 pounds take down a moose that can weigh 1,200 to 1,300 pounds? It's an incredible feat, and it's helped by a lot of different adaptations and behaviors. One is that they are crepuscular animals, meaning they are adapted to being most alert and awake at dawn and dusk, which is when most deer and moose and ungulates are awake. So they are active at the same time. They have these amazingly large paws. And this is, by the way, one of the best ways to tell the difference. If a canid walks through your backyard after a snowfall, if you want to see if it's a coyote or potentially a wolf, if it's not about the size of at least the palm of your hand, it's got to be a little bit bigger than that to be even considered close to being a wolf. Most of the time, if you're seeing an animal, a canid walk through your backyard, it's probably going to be a coyote. Wolves don't like being near people anyway. They're more neophobic than coyotes, and so it's very unlikely it is a wolf in your backyard. But the other thing is just look at the size difference in the paws. 2 to 4 inches for a wolf, as opposed to 1 to 2 inches for a coyote. Another thing that's really interesting about their paws is they have interdigital webbing. So, sort of like we've got this little skin between their thumb and our forefinger, they have that between all of their digits on their paw, and that helps their paw act like a snowshoe on the top of the snow when they're walking on top. And that's, I mentioned earlier that they have a harder time catching deer in the summer than they do in the winter. And that's one of the main reasons, is often they can walk and run across the top of the snow, whereas the deer with its, very round hooves is punching through the snow and getting caught up in those big snow drifts, and it slows them down so that the wolves can capitalize on that. And then there's just their stamina and speed. They are just persistent animals. They can sustain up to a 38 mile per hour for 20 minutes. So they can not only, they're not going to, outrace a lot of these animals, but they're going to outlast a lot of these animals. That's their strategy. And they also are social animals. And so they use their social connections with other wolves to take turns chasing after animals, so that the animal has to keep running because now another wolf is chasing it, whereas they can kind of take turns and take breaks. So they use their ability to just wear down animals. And they've often been recorded kind of persistently hunting an animal for 6, 7, even up to 9 hours before they kill. And even if they don't get it that day, they might come back the next day. So that's really one of their main strategies. Now, I should say this is also a good point, a good time for me to say they're not always successful. In fact, this was one of the big discoveries in the last 40, 50 years of wolf research, is that they fail at hunts way more often than they are successful. In fact, in Minnesota, the estimate is they're only successful about 7 to 10% of the time that they go on a hunt. So that's part of the reason they're so persistent is they know they've just got to keep going and keep going because they never know which hunt is going to be the one that gets them a belly full of food. They are also very selective in how they hunt, and this is something that has been proven over and over in research where they've looked at the bones of the animals that end up dying or being successfully hunted by wolves. And they have found that there is a much higher percentage of old animals and very young animals and sick animals, animals with arthritis or other bone diseases, something that is slowing them down, that the wolves can pick up on often without even, from our eyes, we can't see a noticeable limp, but they can pick up on something and they hone in on that animal and take it down. And then afterwards, scientists go in and say, oh yeah, that animal had something that was impacting it, making it a little less healthy than the others. This is a really interesting area of research. Right now, one of the areas that's being studied is whether wolves actually can reduce the spread of chronic wasting disease in ungulate populations by selectively hunting out those animals with disease. And there are several researchers who are looking at that. They're also looking at, can wolves help reduce the amount of spread of brainworm between deer and moose populations by keeping moose and deer populations, when there are wolves in the area, moose and deer tend to huddle together closer and not intermix as much. So they're looking at, is there ability in reducing spread of disease that way? So just a lot of interesting research going on in this particular arena. And then, like I talked about before, they're social carnivores. This is also probably one of the things that people love about them the most. This is where we all connect with them because they live in families, sort of like we live in families, and they have these great relationships. Which if you want to take a look at our pack on our webcams, people are always commenting on who's connecting with who, and as Rika is getting older, who's Rika connecting with more, Grayson or Axel, and we all love, humans love a good relationship story, and wolves fill that niche for us. They provide us lots of interesting dynamics and interesting relationships to tell stories about, even if they may not be 100% scientifically accurate stories, but they're definitely fun to watch. All right, I'm getting to the end of my presentation, and I just wanted to kind of finish up with a couple of main points. And I think, Linda, you asked at the beginning if I could really say, what are the challenges facing wolves right now here in the United States and around the globe? The interesting thing is we know what wolves need to thrive. They really need three main things. They need wildlands. That means just wild spaces where they can raise their packs and be pretty much away from people when they want to be. Like I said, they don't enjoy living near us the way coyotes do. They like to be far away from us, so they need a little bit of room. They need food. They need these large ungulates, whether it's white-tailed deer or moose. It's one of the reasons why they've reestablished much more successfully here in North America than they have in Europe. Europe really wiped out a lot of their prey species back in the 1900s and 1800s, and we have a lot of deer and moose and elk still. So that's one of the reasons wolves have been coming back here. This is the tricky one, though. They also need tolerance. So you can have really perfect wolf habitat that has big open spaces and lots of food for them to eat. But if you don't have a tolerant human population in that area, they aren't going to be successful. And this is one of the most challenging aspects of my job right now, and the job of the International Wolf Center. And it's gotten harder because it's become so political, right? It's become a badge of honor to say you smoke a pack a day, But on the other side, it's also become, a political issue to love wolves and, just assume that wolves never cause any problems. We know that wolves on landscapes do occasionally kill livestock. It's a very small percentage of the overall livestock out in wolf territory, but they do that. And if you are that rancher who loses, 6 or 7 head of sheep to a wolf in your area, it's a real loss, and it's very emotional. So these are emotionally charged topics, and it's a really important discussion to have. And we, as the International Wolf Center, are trying to advocate for using good science-based information to help make good decisions about wolves. But that often gets lost in these storylines when wolves become a little bit of a political football. So that's the big challenge right now, and we're doing a lot to try to counter myths that we find online. Unfortunately, one of the things we've noticed in the last few years is there have been certain kind of tropes or myths about wolves that used to be talked about back in the 60s and 70s, and we thought they were gone, but now they've started to come back. So you'll see ads talking about people afraid to send their kids to the school bus stop because there are wolves in the area. Well, I can tell you a wolf in the United States has never attacked a child at a bus stop. That just doesn't happen. But that doesn't stop people from saying that I'm afraid to send my kid to the bus stop, and then all of a sudden that gets out there and it gets into the public dialogue. So it's a very challenging environment to educate in. And that's though that is part of the reason we stay non-political, is we're trying to stay open to all sides in the discussion and be available to be an information resource. But like I said, it's a challenging conversation. So there are several ways that you can connect with us if you are interested, even there in Northern Illinois. Now, if you can get up to Ely, I would highly encourage it. It's a beautiful place to visit. I was talking earlier that we are open in the winter. We're open on weekends in the winter, and then 7 days a week in the summer. But winter is a great time to visit too. If you like snowshoeing or want to try your hand at dog sledding, the Ely area is an amazing place. But if you can't get up there, there are many other ways that you can connect with us. We have members all over the world. We have members in all parts of the globe. And as members, you get a quarterly magazine called International Wolf that has stories about wolves all over, and the wolf recovery story. We also have an amazing website, wolf.org, that has some great resources for folks. And also you can get on webcams and watch our ambassador pack 24 hours a day. My daughter obsessively sits on her phone and watches our wolves often. I've made sure she doesn't do it at school, but she does get on there quite a bit. And then talking about schools, we do have virtual field trips. So we were talking earlier about one of the good things about COVID is that we all got better at using webinars and field and virtual programming. And we teach virtual wolf programming anywhere across the world. And right now we have a special deal where we've had a donor the last couple of years who's sponsored our virtual wolf link programs. So if you have a school, a K through 12 school that would like a wolf program, it's absolutely free for the school. So they just need to sign up online, find a date that works for our educators, and they can have a 45-minute free wolf link program for their classroom. And we also do homeschool classes and things like that too. So we're very flexible in the type of programming we offer. And then here's just some more teases if you're interested in a trip up to Ely. We also, like I said, we do dog sled programs. We do a very fun program where you learn how to be a wolf scientist and go out and track radio-collared wolves out in the wild. That's what the woman in the lower left corner is, called Tracking the Pack. We still have some radio-collared wolves, wild wolves that live around our center. And then, of course, the Boundary Waters canoe area is right by our facility. So there's lots of things to experience and do up in Ely. if you have the ability to get up there. All right, that was a whirlwind tour, but I think I made it in my 45 minutes. That was what my goal. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions and what you would be interested in.
All right. The first question is, what
Hold
is
on
the
1 second first.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now you can do the first question.
All right. What is the average age of the wolves in the wild? How long do they live?
Yeah, so average wolf in the wild only gets to be about 5 or 6 years old.
Okay.
There's just a lot of things that can happen to a wolf. I mentioned the 50% mortality in that first year of life. In fact, I just listened to a webinar by Kira Cassidy, who's a researcher at Yellowstone Wolf Project, and they are now officially establishing, based on demographics, elderly. You can call a wolf elderly if it gets to be 6 years old.
Oh, wow.
Now, in captivity, wolves live much longer. So we have had wolves, most of our wolves and Ely on average live to be about 12 years old. We actually had one wolf, Grizzer, who just passed away last year, who was 17 and a half. He was the oldest we'd ever had. So wolves have the capability of getting quite a bit older, but just, the wild it's a tough place. There's a lot of things, that can happen. Starvation is a big thing for wolves, and disease. And of course, getting kicked in the head by a moose. So.
Okay. Doug asks, why don't Utah and Nevada have established wolves?
Yeah, I think most people assume that wolves will eventually move in there, although the terrain there is probably not as suited for the northwestern subspecies that is in Wyoming, Yellowstone. So probably the wolves that would make the most sense to go live in Utah and Nevada are actually the Mexican subspecies of wolf in Arizona and New Mexico. That subspecies is not expanding very quickly because outside of the areas where they live right now, there is a lot of what I call human wolf conflict. There's still a lot of people shooting wolves that are outside their kind of protected areas.
Okay.
I want to jump ahead of you for a minute, Steve, and ask a question about the wolves in Canada. How are they doing, and how are they doing along our border? Are there problems, and is Canada doing its job to protect their wolves?
Well, that's an interesting thing. So Canada is a huge, what I'd call source population for the United States. There's maybe 30 to 40,000 wolves in Canada. And, we in Minnesota like to credit the wolves in Wisconsin and Michigan as being Minnesota wolves that came over. But the reality is there probably were Canadian wolves that started coming down. And the same thing happened in Montana. While we were reintroducing wolves in Yellowstone and Idaho, there were wolves coming down from Canada into Montana at the same time. Wolves are an interesting thing up in Canada. When you have a lot of an animal, like a wolf, especially a controversial animal that has some, conflict with humans, it is much more, it is definitely treated more like a game species up there. It is hunted and trapped across Canada pretty regularly. And there is a lot of discussion right now, especially around the protection of the caribou populations that are up there. So there's a lot of discussions about how many wolves if you have a diminishing caribou population, and wolves are part of what's driving that caribou population down, do you go out and kill a bunch of wolves to help the caribou population prop up? Whereas some people say, well, the part of the reason the caribou population is going down is you're hunting them too much, and so maybe we could reduce the amount of hunting. So there's a lot of that kind of discussion that's going on up in Canada. And then I guess Canada's a big place, right? So there's actually a lot of storylines going on. There's the eastern wolf. Is the eastern wolf its own species that's over in Quebec, that area, where they're really looking at whether that eastern Algonquin wolf should be protected as its own species. And then there's these crazy wolves over in British Columbia that are eating sea otters, and they're studying those too. So there's a lot of interesting subplots going on up in Canada.
All right. Diane asked if they opportunistically steal food from coyote kills or eagle kills or other predators that might have dropped something or left something.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Wolves are definitely opportunistic. If they came across a kill from another animal, or even something that was maybe hit by a car and by the side of the road, you would see wolves chew on it. It actually becomes one of the problems. They'll have they'll set up these programs to compensate ranchers or farmers for losing livestock to wolf kill. But you have to prove it's a wolf kill. And one of the challenges will be an animal like a cow might drop dead because it's sick or something else is going on, and wolves will find it and they'll eat it. And so you'll see, so you have to kind of do a little bit of research to find, was it dead already? Or what animal was the first animal that was there? Was it a bear or was it a wolf? There's a lot of possibilities there.
Okay, well, that was one of our questions. Do the states compensate ranchers? Another one, Linda asked, are the wolves susceptible to diseases of their prey? You mentioned the roadkill. Can they catch something for eating old meat?
Not much with old meat. In fact, wolves kind of notoriously have an amazing gut that can eat almost anything, but they do get disease. But probably the biggest culprit for for transmitting diseases to wolves would be pet dogs. Dogs have this thing called parvovirus, and that is very much something that wolves can get. And if a wolf gets parvovirus, it can wipe out a whole litter. It can be really, really bad. So, and there are other viruses there that can infect them. And then they also can get avian flu. So birds, we actually have to inoculate and check our wolves in our pack often because the ravens come in and feed off the same thing that our wolves are feeding off of, and so we're always watching to make sure they're not getting something from them.
Okay. All right. Did wolves change the ecology of Yellowstone?
Yeah, I think the answer is very much yes. However, it's not maybe as straightforward as some of the videos you'll find on the internet, how wolves changed rivers. The storyline goes, wolves were introduced into Yellowstone, and the elk and bison populations were greatly diminished, and they changed their behavior. They started to congregate in different parts of the park where they were more protected from wolves. That allowed vegetation to regrow around some of the area's rivers, which created better habitat for beavers and other things. So it really kind of changed the landscape. However, I know I've read some articles that said, well, at the same time wolves were reintroduced, the grizzly bear population also bumped up, and mountain lions started moving back into the park too. So there were multiple predators all kind of coming in and increasing their presence in Yellowstone at the same time. So we know those changes happened. How much of it was wolf related and how much was related to these other predators and other management changes in the park is a little bit muddy. But sure. Yes, predators definitely change ecosystems.
Okay. I have no more questions here on my list. If anybody else has any questions, now's your time.
I have one more.
Oh, there we go.
The question lady has one more. Do you know what the status of the wolf population on Isle Royale is currently?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think they're saying about 15 now, which is incredible when you consider it was down to 2 as of 2019, but they did reintroduce wolves from Michipitokan Island. So they basically took wolves from a different island and put them on Isle Royale to help reestablish. And they've had litters 2 years in a row. So they're really feeling good about that. they're hoping, they haven't gotten quite the data yet, because COVID really wiped out one of their study seasons, but they're hoping to see that they've really reduced the moose population, because my understanding is when the wolf population was down to 2, the moose were just going nuts on that island, and you couldn't find saplings of trees that were higher than 2 inches high, because the moose were just eating them all immediately. So it's good to have the wolves back there.
What do you think about these organizations like Defenders of Wildlife and some of the other organizations that are trying to pay the ranchers off for these wolf kills? Do they work? I know that there are a lot of these organizations.
Yeah. Actually, somebody mentioned do governments pay or do defenders pay? It kind of depends. Each state's a little different. Some states have compensation programs directly to the ranchers where the state pays, and some, the state doesn't have it, or they only have a minimal payment, and then a group like Defenders of Wildlife will come in and supplement it. I think what does it work is the question. I would say we've seen those programs in existence long enough to say that compensation by itself doesn't change the rancher's attitude towards wolves. And because if that was working, we would have seen it by now. And if anything, I think the rancher attitude towards wolves has gone the other direction. Does it help in localized settings? Yeah, I do think there are some examples now of more and more relationships that are being built between organizations and individual ranchers, where they're trying non-lethal techniques on their ranches and getting some good success. But I think that's kind of more localized, and it's more based on building relationships with people, which at the end of the day, that's what ultimately really works, is when you get past the kind of the big global plans and you meet people face to face and have real conversations with them, but that's hard to do.
Well, Grant, I have no more questions. I really do have a lot more, but I won't ask them. We can't thank you enough. You've certainly been a highlight to our 2022 speaker series, and we are so very grateful to you. We will be posting this when I get it. I'll send it out to everybody. I'm not really good at being prompt, but I promise I will send this out. And I will include information from Grant about the International Wolf Center, so people can look it up and perhaps come and visit you. So as I said, this is the last of our Sunday speaker series for 2022. There's my bird. It's 8 o'clock. Time to go watch TV. At any rate, these Woods and Wetlands events are going on hiatus, but we'll be back. And we'll be back with exciting talks, adventures, events, and ways for you to get involved and to help us all get together to make the world a better place and protect it for our progeny. I would say watch the newsletter that our wonderful volunteers put together, and I will be getting back to you. We're going to try to avoid some of the conflicts on Valentine's Day and Super Bowl Day. Anybody that has any ideas, send them on to me. I think we're going to try to stick with Sunday evenings because there are no other meetings. So once again, thank you all for coming, and thank you. Please, let's get out there and save the wolves.
All right, thanks, Linda.
Good night.